This is Popping the Bubble with hosts Sandra Ponce de Leon and Pete A. Turner.
Hi, I'm Ori Brafman. I'm author of The Starfish and The Spider, and I'm lecturer at UC Berkeley School of Business. And you're listening to Popping the Bubble.
Hi, Ori. Thank you so much for joining us. It's really great to have you here. And we are here at the Starfish Mission, which is a really awesome collaborative workspace with a focus on the blockchain community.
Right.
Having some really great conversations here. And actually, because of John Connors, he actually lent me this book, and that was how I got tuned into what you're doing and this awesome book, The Starfish and The Spider. Loving it so far. So thanks, for joining us. It's really great to have you.
Thanks for having me, and it's great to be here at the Starfish Network. It was very cool. A few weeks ago, I heard about the space and that learning that Starfish influenced it, and it is great and great to see the concepts of the book play out in real life.
Yeah. We'll talk a little bit about that because we're here in a space that's called Starfish.
Yeah.
Your book is called The Starfish and The Spider.
Right.
So how does that all relate to each other?
So the book, the central theme of the book is you take a spider and you cut off its head, it's going to die, and you cut off the arm of a starfish, it grows on back. That's because unlike the spider, the starfish doesn't have a central brain. And you think about that as a metaphor for business and society, everything from Alcoholics Anonymous to Wikipedia. These distributed organizations that don't have top-down structure, that don't have as much of hierarchy. And you see examples all over the place. The book ended up in very different places. Was quoted by the Tea Party, one of its
Really?
And you can guess my politics. I teach at Berkeley. I live in San Francisco, right? Ended up...
You're super conservative.
No comment. Ended up with the U.S. military in terms of how to fight distributed networks like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, and also influenced some of the early thinking about Bitcoin and blockchain in terms of, you think about blockchain as really a very starfish approach to digital trust. And I think we're just starting to see, as you know better than me, I think this is just the tip of the iceberg here in terms of the possibilities for people to self-organize.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. So you were really kind of ahead of the whole blockchain revolution.
Right, I should have written this 10 years later. Maybe.
Yeah,
It
right.
came out in 2006.
Yeah, when it came out, people were like, who cares if if an organization doesn't have top-down structure, like, why do we have to pay attention? And the big shift, I think, happened that people can organize much more effectively using technology these days. And that entire industries, I would say right now, if you're in an industry and you don't know who your starfish is, you're like the poker player who doesn't know who the worst player is, right? On the table. And I remember talking to bankers 5-10 years ago, and they're like, who cares about this, right? And like, well, actually, there's a... there's a pretty big threat, yeah.
Yeah, so those conversations, what's the difference between those conversations then and now?
That's a great question. We should have a time machine. It flipped so quickly. So back then people were like, well, this is... people didn't necessarily know whether it would really influence their business and really whether... A couple of weeks ago, I had this interesting conversation and with someone, and they were like, I was at a party, and they were like, yeah, what do you do, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, oh, yeah, I wrote a book called Starfish and The Spider. And they're like, oh, yeah, the starfish thing, like, did you borrow from that? I was like, no, we coined it. I was like, oh, okay. So it's really fun.
Yeah, so you wrote this about decentralized systems, but not necessarily about blockchain, or did it?
This is before blockchain existed,
right,
as far
exactly.
as I know.
Yeah, so did you know that, like, when blockchain started becoming coming to the surface in terms of an emerging technology, were you aware of it, and were you aware of how it paralleled with your work on the book?
I think that from the very beginning, what's interesting to me about blockchain, it isn't just the distributed approach, but also that a lot of starfish organizations are at their core based on shared values, and that there is a shared ethos, I think, in the blockchain community. With that, I think that it's also important to distinguish between, the get-rich-quick schemes and the things that are actually trying to change the world in a positive way. It was very cool seeing that these concepts, which we originally looked at historically, right? The anti-slavery movement, the women's suffrage movement, Alcoholics Anonymous, all relied on the same basic DNA. And then to see that DNA becoming even more used is exciting. And I think that it's such a testament that we really want to be able to interact with one another in more efficient ways, from a pure economic way, and that we're finally able to.
I think that the book is really awesome, and I think that there's just been so many concepts that I've kind of, dog-eared and like underlined here. But I think that this, talk a little bit about this concept of norms versus rules and how that applies to decentralized organizations.
Mm-hmm. So a top-down structure is going to have to rely on rules. When you think about it, whether good or bad, comes at a price. Mm-hmm. You pay an economic price for example, you pay about a 20% premium to get 51% of a company versus 49% of a company. And norms, when you don't have top-down hierarchy, you have to actually rely on who's going to enforce your rules. You have to rely on collective norms. And then in a way that they're actually much more efficient. Because if I know the norms that you're coming in to this with, then I'll know how to interact with you better, and I'll be able to govern norms more from a lateral perspective than from looking out for the cops and letting them enforce. And think about speeding on the freeway, right? Who doesn't speed on the freeway? Everyone does, and unless there's a cop around, because there's a rule about
right.
But if there's a norm about, hey, this is how we drive in certain areas, and we look at each other, and all of a sudden you would be less likely to break that norm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think it's super interesting because every different society, every different region in the world, and has its own set of acceptable societal norms, right?
Right.
What goes here in California or in the U.S. in Italy, like for example, standing in line to wait for something, that concept doesn't exist.
Right.
Think about how those norms develop and how they're self-governed by the society itself.
Right. And we signed up for these hierarchies without really, and still, if you're trying to ship a car from one part of the earth to another, you maybe need a more centralized approach. But increasingly, we're seeing that a decentralized approach, and more assets become digital, that you don't need that centralization, and therefore you ask, well, do we need all the hierarchy that comes with it? Do we need all the rules that come with it? Is there a different way of interacting with one another that looks at people more as equal? And there's a basic assumption that a lot of Starfish organizations make, which is everyone wants to contribute. Everyone wants to be able to be helpful in some way. Mm-hmm. How do we open the possibilities for people to be able to contribute?
Right. Well, I think it's also interesting your perspective because you are a professor at Berkeley.
Yeah.
And so that in and of itself is a hierarchical structure where you are the professor. Are you applying any of these? So
the course that teaches improvisational leadership.
Oh.
I try to abide by these principles, and really the idea there is that the answers are oftentimes going to be in the room. And it's up to us to be able to figure it out collectively. When there's one expert, think about the last meeting you've had to sit through, right? And there's one expert talking, and how much problem solving actually takes place in that environment, as opposed to an environment where you can all sit and you can talk more as equals. And what's interesting about Starfish organizations is that they allow for people to have more creativity and to actually get more things done, and that you essentially follow and amplify whatever has worked.
Yeah, I think that that leads into the concept of collaboration and working together to solve a common problem. And I think that that's something that a lot of large companies that are spider companies struggle with. Is like they're battling the starfish that are up and coming, but they're a spider. but they know that they need to innovate or they're going to die. So, what do they do? How do they integrate these principles, especially when the culture is so rigid, right?
Yeah. What's been interesting is that spider companies or organizations are actually terrific hosts for starfish organizations. So several years ago, I heard from this guy named Marty Dempsey, who was a general in the U.S. Army. And up to that point, I had really had no interaction with anyone in uniform. My first question was, is there a 5-star general? And I was like, no. He was in charge of leadership at the Army and then went on to become in charge of the entire military. He was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. And when they were trying to figure out how do we combat these very distributed networks, we worked to create starfish networks within a very hierarchical Army environment to have more innovation, to get more a sense of inclusion, to create more sense of belonging. And lo and behold, these individual circles became very, very effective and started up some very interesting initiatives. So that if the U.S. Army can embrace more of a starfish approach, I think so can companies. And the question becomes, how do you encourage these networks? How do you encourage lateral accountability? And then how do you amplify what is effective within that system? Because they're difficult to control, but they also produce a lot of creativity.
Yeah. What's the answer? How do you do it?
How do you do it? On a very granular level, it really is, think about an hour or two, how you spend it with people that you work with. Is it a very structured? Is it very hierarchical? Is it very top-down? Or are there ways to be a little bit more human, even in that little 2-hour to think about it more from the wisdom is here in this room, and it's my job as a manager to be able to listen to it and to find out where in the network it exists. But to also be very business-focused about it. This isn't about sitting around and singing Kumbaya. This is about being effective.
When you look at a spider organization like the Army, and they go to somewhere there's a conflict zone, they've got a skill set. The institutional knowledge is driven on close with and destroy the enemy. Like, that's their job. But in a decentralized fight, that doesn't always work. So there's other aspects, other elements of the fight you have to master. One of those things is culture. So how do you take an organization that's really good and incented to train? I mean, a commander's ethos is to keep their people alive by training and getting everything ready. But to get the win, you've got to surrender that and focus on social, cultural, political, religious aspects in these decentralized fights.
Right. Interestingly, what we've learned from 17 years now is when you're looking in theater or on the pointy end of the spear, the Army and the military are actually very starfish. They've learned to become much more adaptive, and they know that when you're in the fight, you have to improvise on the spot.
And not always ask for permission.
They call it it's something called commander's intent, which is a really cool concept. So you have the intent of the commander, and then it's up to you to figure out how to actually execute that. Staying within legal, what's legal and ethical. It's when they come home to the big bureaucracy that all of a sudden this is centralizing more and more. There's a story I heard from this guy who was in charge of like 100 people overseas, comes home and wants to do a barbecue and needs to get permission about what he's able to barbecue, whether it's chicken or whatever. And you're like, yeah, it's that level of granular kind of control that might not actually be helping the organization. And you think about that in business as well, right? Where we've become so fixated on compliance, that we sometimes avoid one person kind of go off the rules. We've kind of quelched creativity. And it's interesting that people have realized, like, yeah, we need to, and I think blockchain has been a huge wake-up call. So I work with a lot of financial services companies, and there's a huge wake-up call. They realize that this is a different world that we have to deal with. And a lot of banks are even realizing, hey, there's an uncertain future, right? So Now they're calling up saying, like, how can we be agile? And I'm like, well, let me tell me about a time that you've heard of any single time that a person who's very rigid goes to like a 2-day training or a 5-day training and comes back and comes back agile. I was like, that doesn't happen, right? It's not a human. It's not about a human trait. It's about how do we create more adaptive systems and networks, where each individual node of the network need not necessarily be agile, but depending on the context of the situation, they can. Depending on the context, they can speak up and help the organization. So one example comes from hospital. One of the biggest killers in hospitals, staph infection. More people die from staph infection than HIV/AIDS every year.
Wow.
And as a way of preventing it, you wash your hands.
Mm-hmm.
So this hospital's put up big signs that said, hey, wash your hands. And that didn't work. So they put up bigger signs and that didn't work. And they sent doctors to like trainings about washing their hands, and that didn't work. And the reason for that is information doesn't change behavior. If it did, no one would smoke, everyone would floss. And instead, what we did, we organized folks into a more Starfish approach. And in one hospital, they have the head of infection control all the way to the janitor. And the janitor spoke up and said, I noticed that in this wing where there's a lot of infections, the garbage cans are empty. No one's using gloves. We're like, oh, interesting. Go over to the wing and ask the nurse, why aren't you guys using gloves? And the nurses say, well, in this specific wing, the nurses have extra small hands, and this hospital's so cheap, they won't give us enough extra small gloves.
Wow.
And we said, well, what if we give you more extra small gloves? And well, of course, we'd use them. The janitor busts out a pen, writes his number, and every time they run out of extra small gloves, they call him and he puts more in the box. It's small incremental changes like that in 1 year reduce staph infection by 70%.
Mm.
Now, it's not to say that the janitor should be made the head of infection control, nor is it to say that every wing should have extra small gloves, but rather it's about how do you give people enough of a voice to saying like, hey, you're closer to the edge, you probably have better information than I do. How do I create an environment where I can listen to you and you can be heard?
Yeah, this is all giving me, I'm seeing parallels between the concept of design thinking and customer centricity, and this whole notion that companies are going through today, which is digital transformation, and now putting the customer at the center, and how do we apply these new emerging trends so that centricity is, flows through every single silo. So it's very interesting that the Starfish approach is, it really is infiltrating, everywhere.
Yeah, and I think because it's empowering for people.
Right.
It's empowering for us to know, like, hey, I can do something that will actually matter.
Yeah.
And I think that's why we're seeing such an explosion. People want not just their voices heard, but their agency.
Yeah, absolutely. What was your original inspiration behind writing Starfish and Spider?
So I was on a plane on September 10th, 2001, from Boston to San Francisco, and realized that the world was a different place. The next day.
Wow.
And I co-founded a nonprofit that engaged CEOs in peace and economic development issues. And we got some funding, and people asked us two questions that were good questions, but they were the wrong questions. The first one was, who's in charge? And I was like, I was like, in my 20s. There's a bunch of CEOs. And the second question was, what's your strategy? And the strategy was just to keep the network growing. And we had these different circles of 6 Indians and 6 Pakistanis, 6 Americans, 6 Saudis. And some of the circles had some really remarkable results. The biggest one was probably the India-Pakistan group. The Pakistanis invited the Indians to visit. There was no flights between the two countries. They chartered a special jet. They got special permission. And when they landed, the president of Pakistan was there and said, with this flight, I hereby open up the borders between the two countries. Wow. And it took India 2 months to reciprocate. And there's now flights between Karachi and Mumbai. And people were like, how did you do this? And we said, well, it wasn't us, it was the network. And it was trying to understand how this specific decentralized network, Starfish network, became so effective. that we started looking at history and started looking around us and saying, wait a second, this is the same creatures in very different industries are having very extraordinary effects.
Wow, very cool. I mean, what an amazing thing to be part of, right?
Right?
Yeah,
very
incredible.
unexpected. Very unexpected leaving business school that this is where we'd end up.
Wow,
Yeah.
wow. And so since then, you've had several other books that you've written. You
Yes.
can talk a little bit about those?
Sure. My second book I wrote with my brother. It's called Sway. It's about behavioral economics and irrational decision making. I also wrote a book called Click about instant connections. When you meet someone and you just have an instant connection with them. And then I wrote a book called The Chaos Imperative in my mind, they're all coherent because it's about human psychology and about how humans interact with one another. Chaos Imperative is about the need for a little bit of chaos, organized chaos within very structured systems. And my most recent book is called Radical Inclusion, and I wrote it with Martin Dempsey.
Okay, radical inclusion sounds very Burning Man.
And I think Burning Man is, Burning Man is, I think, as big of a starfish as you can get, and I think that I say this and people are like, huh? Like, when I'm in DC, I think you cannot understand Silicon Valley without understanding Burning Man, and that Burning Man is the spiritual soul core of Silicon Valley, and this notion of you can participate, and it's up to you to participate. And that if you have a crazy idea, my role is to either get out of the way or help you. Mm-hmm. Have you gone?
Yes.
What do you think of the analysis? Is it a spiritual?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that there is something very spiritual about the creation process of the gift that you're going to bring to the playa. I felt that. I made jewelry, so I made pendants with the man on there. So I think that even leading up to it, it is a spiritual process because you have to enlist your creativity and whatever outfits that you make or bring. And I think it's also just a beautiful thing to be able to go and not have a care in the world and just ride your bike in whatever direction. Mm-hmm. You hear the best beat. and of course the survival aspect. I mean, it's an interesting experience. I always say I laugh and I cry every single morning that I get to because there's also the negativity aspect of it and the experiences or the people that you come across that maybe aren't on the same plane as you and give you a bad trip.
Yep. And I think it's taught me about what happens when you just change a very simple concept. When you change the concept of either competition or exchange. Yeah. Where because there's no barter and there's no commerce, all the things that the second, third, or fourth order effect of everyone coming into an environment trying to gift. And I think that it probably applies very well to blockchain as well, right? In terms of we can create a system ourselves. Yeah. That can have maybe a slightly different set of rules and what emerges from that system.
Yeah, the possibilities are quite endless, and it's nice to be here and talking to some of these folks and the inspirations that they have about a new world, right?
It's very inspiring, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that with Burning Man, you come back tired, exhausted, deprived, but then you have that sort of. The sadness factor because you're back in the default world and you have to get back to the rigid society that we live in and these particular constructs and so there's a bit of a depression that sets in, but there's also the inspiration of having seen all this crazy wild artwork and the creations that come to life and how the hell did you think of that?
Right.
How
exactly.
do you think about putting, a Pac-Man on wheels?
Right.
or a skeleton or a giraffe, like all of these crazy things. And
we had a giraffe.
Did you?
Art card.
That your art card?
Yeah.
Oh, I think maybe that's why I read about
it.
Yes. That was top of mind. Are you going next year?
I hope to.
Yeah.
Yeah, I had I'm heading out of town, so I couldn't make it, but how about you?
Next year for sure.
Next year for sure?
Yeah. We'll find each other in the dust.
Absolutely. Are you, or are you just like,
It's not my
your
thing. Not my thing.
You've been in the desert and the dust, so
yeah.
you've been you were accustomed to that harsh environment.
I had my fill.
You've had your fill.
Yeah. Yeah. I hear about how magical the dirt is, and I'm like, that's good. I've had all of it.
I grew up in Texas, so I can relate.
Yeah.
I can stand the desert. I definitely don't have...
Yeah.
I'm not there for the desert.
I've got all of the misery badges, all of them, so I'm good on that. I do want to ask you, so one of the things that we get here in the Silicon Valley is companies talk about in terms of like creating a culture. But creating a culture, from my experience, doesn't tolerate design. Mm-hmm. Like you can say, here's our corporate culture. If I go down to the ends of the edges of the Starfish and I look and I try to find the CEO's version of culture, I'm probably not going to find it. Like if their keywords are family and creativity and innovation or something like that, and I'm going to go find screw off, divorce, anger. Or whatever it's going to be, disengagement.
Yeah.
So something happens in that with the best intention, something happens in an organization that makes it, even in Starfish. Yeah. Because culture's wiggly. It doesn't cooperate.
It's very wiggly, and we're very dishonest about it. We put so many words that are completely meaningless, and we don't reward people for them.
Right.
Which is why we end up with a lot of organizations with a really crappy culture. I think for culture to... This brings us to the first question you asked about norms. I think culture is much more rooted in norms than it is about a vision statement that might seem BS to a lot of people, both from in the company and from out the company. We're like, Culture is much more emergent when you create a certain set of norms. So if you're creating a set of norms that, hey, people are heard, or people are included, or that your contribution matters, or that you have a sense of belonging, then what emerges from that? And we tend to think about culture trying to shove it down people's throats, which is never effective.
Right.
I think that when you let it emerge and you constantly live it and you embrace it with norms and rewards, then you have a better shot at actually shaping something that is going to be inherently very squishy, and it's hard to describe in a 2-sentence.
Sure. So I'm thinking, like right now, currently in the news is all of the Twitter stuff with Alex Jones and Peter Van Buren being banned and all this kind of thing where they're, and then the Twitter also saying, hey, we lean left, which, whatever, it's San Francisco, that's what they do. Mm-hmm. But the problem starts to come in is like when you try to, so it's a social media platform and you try to engage at Jack and you get nothing. So you have the social media engagement platform, and here's the king of it, who says, I lean this way, I block this way. And it's like, it's almost a self-fulfilling prophecy that someone on the blockchain side will say, we can do better than that. We can all tolerate some candor and some openness. And this, if you're going to make me give up my information to be on this, it's a problem. But can Jack see that?
That's a great question. So I started asking questions in terms of disintermediation. So at the end of the day, a social media company will have to monetize its users. Mm-hmm. But there's nothing that says that, wait a second, can we have a Facebook or a Twitter that is completely on the blockchain and maybe isn't monetized? And because it's not monetized, it's people are like, oh, whatever, I don't really... It's almost like a Gestalt psychology. You can't address it because it's a non-monetized approach. I think the same thing... you have to ask, do you need that kind of company to facilitate it, or can you facilitate it with each other? Even questions about ride sharing. Eventually, can you just have an algorithm that is relatively very small, and that allows people to coordinate with one another, and even, who knows, maybe even do commerce on some kind of digital currency. And all of a sudden, what's it? They take the 20% that you take, or something like that is
yeah. I mean, that's why companies like that get disintermediated. I used to be a TaskRabbit guy. I was the busiest TaskRabbit, #1 rated in the area, and my customers would constantly approach me saying, "We can cut them out."
Right.
I'm like, okay, well, you're my customer, so whatever you want, Right. And TaskRabbit couldn't find a way to make an incentive. They could only try to punish, but I own the relationship.
Exactly.
So that's an extreme example. But yeah, with Uber, you don't, or Lyft or whatever, and it's ride sharing. I don't really need the app, especially if there's someone else creates one on the blockchain that is unmanned and unstoppable. It's like, well, I really am just going to the airport, and I'm only going to charge you whatever, $4 or whatever instead of 25 or whatever it is.
I think that there's the conversation that we have about blockchain oftentimes is about digital trust. I think that we're bifurcating the conversation, that there's digital trust, but we also need to concentrate on in-person trust. And what I like about what's going on here at Starfish Networks and other blockchain communities is that there's an actual community.
Yeah.
So that if there's people that you actually know,
right,
and that you actually like and want to hang out with them, and then you can start through blockchain having more digital trust and interactions with them, that there can be kind of a community that's a little bit, which kind of ties to Burning Man, right? Burning Man is in the desert. The fact that it's like 80 miles away from anything helps it be its own system.
right.
And that you can kind of decide to join that system. I think that's where things get really, really interesting, right? What happens when a bunch of people there's a doctor, and there's a lawyer, and there's a this, and there's a that, and you're like, hey, we can all actually interact together and more effectively, and that you almost have this potential island of starfish communities within our top-down country.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Do you think, looking into your crystal ball, is that our future? Do spider organizations go away, and do we all become part of starfish?
I think there's a natural tendency to go from very spider to very starfish to very spider to, like, we just go back and forth. And I think that a lot of institutions in our country are very spider, and I think that there's a lot of movement towards much more starfish approaches, and I think that it's going to become more and more interesting to be able to be living in one system while actually mostly interacting. And
how common is it for a spider to think that they're starfish? I mean, isn't that the norm? Like, yeah, we're starfish. We're limbo.
Yeah. That happens a lot when I'll talk to a CEO and they're like, "Yeah, I'm totally starfish," and people are like,
Yeah.
I find it's a little bit like Fight Club. Like the people who are the most adhere to it the most don't talk about themselves in only like I'm a catalyst, and you're like,
I call it the drunkest guy in the bar syndrome. Like the drunkest guy's gonna be the one going, "I'm not drunk.
I'm sober.
Yeah.
I'm fine."
Yeah.
And yeah. It's a good question.
Because it does appear that, from my experience, you see that a lot, and I call it accountability ladder problems, where everybody's on a ladder looking up.
Yep.
And maybe they can see around the guy in front of them,
Yep.
but everybody's oriented upwards, and you need someone external to stand out there and go, do you all see the outputs coming through your system?
Exactly.
You have a starfish heart, but you have this spiderweb thing, and it's impossible. The military is a great example. You have commander's intent. Everybody grabs their pen and goes, okay, let's write the commander's intent down.
Right.
And you have 30 different versions of the commander's intent. Meanwhile, if I go out and I go look for the commander's intent on the ground with an Afghan or an Iraqi or whatever, you bring it back and they're like, that's not what I intend. And that alters his own intent to be more in line with what's happening on the ground. But that has to happen from a trusted agent who's external to the organization.
And it gets created when there's a really strong culture and a really good command culture.
Right.
So there's nothing wrong with command, but command with no lateral input and accountability. That's when things become dangerous.
Just so much to ponder.
Yeah.
So what do you do? You're teaching at Berkeley. What else do you have on your plate?
I'm teaching. The book Radical Inclusion came out a few months ago, and I also we got 100 acres outside of DC with my business partner Tom Rath, who wrote the Students Find Entrepreneur books.
Oh, I love those.
Yeah. So
many times, yeah.
He and I and a couple of our partners started something called the Fully Charged Institute, and the idea being that companies go there and you really are able to interact with your core team as humans, and that we shouldn't separate business strategy from wellness strategy. That really we need to be, by helping each other be healthy and more human, we will actually improve the bottom line of the company.
Wow, awesome.
Yeah, so that we just finished construction of that, and we're opening up in a couple months.
Oh my gosh, so cool.
Yeah, it's neat.
Wow, I'm so impressed with everything that you've done in your career and all of these great books that now I have to get my head into. Is there anything that we didn't cover that maybe you wanted to?
No, this was great. I'm looking forward to continuing the conversation. You have to come visit.
Oh,
Yeah.
And
love it.
we'll do our next podcast on the playa.
Oh, definitely. I don't know how the equipment will hold up then.
Right?
Yeah, that's true.
Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been such an awesome conversation.
Yeah, thank you.